Good morning, good afternoon, right on the edge there. Welcome to today's Memoria Press Facebook Live, and we're going to talk about literature today. Unfortunately, life happens, and my sweet wife, who was going to join us, couldn't make it due to health reasons, but she is watching from home, so sorry she couldn't make it. I do have plenty of her thoughts and insights, her strategies to share, so she is here in spirit, if not in form. So, like I said, we're going to talk about the Memoria Press Literature Program today. We're going to have a model lesson, which is how we're going to spend most of our time. But before I do that, I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss the Memoria Press literature progression as it moves through the curriculum. So in kindergarten, we don't do literature per se. There's lots of books, but we don't have a formal literature program because at that point, we're really learning how to read, right? And that ability, that skill is how we then access literature, isn't it? So in first grade is really where we begin our literature progression. And I have what I think is a helpful analogy for understanding our literature progression. I'm going to share it with you, and then you can decide if it's helpful or not. But if we think about the way that the curriculum progresses, we begin with a book like Little House. Okay, so we'll put Little House down here. Okay, that's going to be in first grade. Students are going to read a book like Little House. And then as they progress through their academic career, they're going to finish with books like Anna Karenina. Okay, or Dante, or a whole litany of other books. It goes without saying that a title like Little House and a title like Anna K are not at all the same. So how do we get a student from here to here? Okay, well, the curriculum will help you with this and it'll adjust, but there are some things that we as teachers need to keep in mind as well. Down here, there's a lot of hand-holding. Up here, there's very little hand-holding. The analogy that I like to use is imagine that you move into a new neighborhood and you settle in and your neighbors next door have children the same age as your children. And as children do, they immediately hit it off. They begin playing in the front yard, carrying sticks if they're boys, other things if they're girls, but immediately they make friends. Well, that's where we're down here. This is you just moved in. You just met these people. You want your kids to be friends with them. You want to be close to them, but you don't know them yet. So there's a lot of oversight involved in their interactions as they play, as they entertain one another, as they have fun. They're probably doing so outside in the front yard, maybe a little bit inside, but probably not having sleepovers or meals together or anything like that. But as time progresses, they get to know each other better. You get to know the kids better, and you get to know their parents better. That's kind of the progression that we have with our curriculum. The amount of intimacy and analysis and nearness grows as the students get to know the ideas of literature, the themes that permeate all books, the literary tools and ideas, the terms that become commonplace to them, and with that, their own capacities, their capacity to read, their vocabulary, their capacity to think through things, their ability to process mature concepts and events, all of those things grow along with the student. And so they go from a Little House to an Anna Karenina. But what we don't want to do is have this hard line where they're in one place and then all of a sudden they jump. So the curriculum, like I said, is going to help you walk your student through this growth, just as you would walk your child through a new relationship with new friends and a new family. Okay, so that's something to think about. Today, we're going to look at a lesson from our 5th grade literature program in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Again, my name is Ryan Weston. I am a part of the schools division here at Memoria Press for most of my time, but I know a lot of you from homeschool events, Sodalitas, different conferences, so many of us may even already know each other. So we're going to look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for our model lesson today, and we're going to be in chapter 4. The way that the Memoria Press curriculum is scheduled for literature depends on the novel that we're reading. So for Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we generally do 2 chapters per week. The lesson plans, as they're given to you, are not intended to be understood as static or rigid. They are a model for you to follow. Life has a way of introducing unforeseen events, and sometimes you need to adjust. And the literature lesson plans really should be considered something that is sequential. So you do this before you do this. You don't necessarily have to do them on the days that they're outlined for you in the lesson plans, though you can. So for what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to try and cover the 2 or 3 days that you have for our lesson all in once. So you're going to have to think about the things that we say and what you see in your guide and what you see on the lesson plans and make it work for your family, in your context, with your schedule. I do have this outline on the board. I'm going to try and follow through this and add some comments as we go. But the first thing that is on your list for teaching a literature lesson is your prep. Now, one of the beauties of Memoria Press's curriculum is that much of the prep, even most of the prep, is done for you, but we would not say all of the prep is done for you. The teacher still needs to familiarize themselves with the material that they're studying. They need to familiarize themselves with what is going to be asked of the student, what's going to be on tests, what's going to be on quizzes. Because again, as we've already established, life happens. Sometimes we have to cut things short. Sometimes we have to skip things. It's really important that if you're going to test your student, that you made sure to introduce the material to them and explain the material to them that you're going to test. So with that in mind, the first thing that you do as far as prep is concerned is you get out your teacher guide. Now, in talking to Nikki about this, she made a really helpful comment. She said there is nothing in the Memoria Press literature program that is not worth reading yourself. And it's fairly simple, but I thought it was pretty astute because books like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe get placed in a category called children's literature. Farmer Boy, Charlotte's Web, these books, that we see them in the third grade literature program, and we think they are third grade books. But there's really nothing more further from the truth than that. Those books are timeless books. They're good books. They're books that anybody of any age can read, younger than them, older than them. So I do encourage you to take to heart the idea that these are books that you can read and you can enjoy and you can use to grow and develop your own virtue, as we're trying to do with the students. But in any case, sometimes you don't have time to read all of the books that your kids are reading, and that's just reality. So in the teacher guide, there is a nice presentation outline of the material that we want to cover and the things that we want to take away from the book. One of the things that I recommend doing is marking your teacher guide. Okay, there's a number of things you can keep in mind when you're marking your teacher guide. One of them is what we already mentioned, testable material. So Nikki mentioned she'll take a highlighter and she will go through, she actually uses the review chapter because the review chapter covers everything that is on the test. And she will use that material and go through the lessons in her teacher manual and highlight questions that are going to be tested so that if something does happen, she made sure to cover those things that she knows that they're going to be tested on. Another thing you can do is in the vocabulary section and in the comprehension questions in particular, is you can jot down in the margin what page number the answers to those questions are on. Now that does take a little bit more digging, but especially at these younger grade levels, it really is not that time consuming. It's not that difficult. You shouldn't have a problem doing that most weeks. Again, my wife, Nikki, would be quick to confess that this is an ideal. There are plenty of pages in her teacher manual that are not marked up at all, and there are plenty of pages in her text that are not marked up at all. But again, we do want to shoot for the ideal and know that that when things happen, when things get in the way, it's okay because of all the other times that we were prepared for the ideal. So insofar as marking the teacher guide is concerned, you're going to mark what pages, okay? You're going to mark what's testable. And then, as time allows, it's also a good idea to mark ideas or terms or questions that correlate to other subjects. So if you have a question about a region of the world, maybe write a G for geography. If you have a word that you know is a derivative of a Latin term that your students have learned, maybe circle that one or mark it with an L. The Memoria Press curriculum really does, by design, include a lot of integration between subjects. It's one of the reasons we don't have some of the subjects that you may be familiar with from your own education or pastime homeschooling, like social studies. Our social studies program is built into our classical studies, our Christian studies, our literature, our history, and so on. So remember to do your best to correlate the content that you're studying in literature with other subjects. Okay? Then, after you've marked your teacher guide, mark your text. So you have a couple of different ways that you can do the reading portion of the literature program. Some families choose to read every word of the novel aloud together. Some families do independent reading, where the student is reading, perhaps reading to their siblings or reading on their own. And then some families kind of do a hodgepodge of both. At the 5th grade level, we would say any of those are fine. As much as possible, a student does need to hear their teacher read, and the teacher probably needs to hear them reading as well. So even if you are on the end of the spectrum that has their student reading independently, when you come together, you do still need to read some excerpts. And the best way to determine what excerpts you read is to have your novel marked, your text marked with the answers to the comprehension questions, to where they can find the definitions for their vocabulary, or at least get an understanding of what their vocabulary words mean. So we talked about marking these things in the teacher guide, and when doing so, you can go ahead and mark it in your novel as well. And that way, when you sit down as a family, you can turn to page 36, for instance, where you know that the second comprehension question is going to be answered, and you can make sure to read that together. Now, it is important to note that I don't mean to suggest that you tell your students, we're reading this because it's on the one of the questions. I think we want that to be more organic. We want them to be hearing what you're reading, and then when they go to the comprehension question, it's familiar to them because you read it together. Other things to mark in your text is to consider where your student is at in terms of their understanding of the material. So if your student is what you're considering gifted, meaning they're excelling, things are coming very naturally, the movement through the student guide is very quick, and they're not having a real problem, well, think about some of your own questions that you can mix in to the novel. These may be questions that are not a part of the comprehension questions or the discussion questions, something that you just want to throw out to challenge your student. The converse of that would be if your student happens to be struggling with the material that you're working through. One of the things that the founder of Memoria Press used to say, Cheryl Lowe, when asked how you make school fun or enjoyable, how do you make learning enjoyable, she would say, if you want students to have joy in learning, ask them questions they know the answer to. And what she's getting at is that light in your student's eye. When you ask them a question and they know the answer, their eyes light up, their smile appears, and they show that they're enjoying what they're doing. So sometimes if you have a student that's struggling, finding some part of the text that is just very obvious, very simple, and ask them a question about it. They're going to enjoy knowing the answer, and they're going to gain confidence. And I expect that will have a really positive impact in the other areas where they were struggling. Okay, so you're going to mark your vocab words, you're going to mark your comprehension questions, you're going to mark questions to challenge gifted students, and questions to encourage struggling students. That is all your prep time. So now we get into the actual lesson, okay? First thing you do when you're beginning a lesson is you review old material. For those of you who are using Memoria Press, that is very familiar to you. That is what we want you to do in essentially every subject. We want to begin with a time of review from the material that they have already learned. Best way to do that for literature is simply to ask for a summary. If we're being candid with ourselves and honest, we know that summary from the student is an opportunity for us to reorient our thinking towards what's happening in this novel. Perhaps this is the 4th novel that you've looked at today with the 4th student, and you don't know whether you are in Anna Karenina or The Little House. And so by offering your student the opportunity to summarize what they've already read, you are also having the opportunity to get yourself back into the novel. And of course, it's true of them too. By summarizing what they've already read, they're getting their mind into the place, because as much as it's true of you, they may have just left geography class, or they may have just left Christian studies class. So they need sort of a reorienting of the mind as well. So a summary is really helpful. This review portion should really only be a few minutes long, maybe 5 minutes. So a summary should be concise. They should not be distracted by details that don't matter quite as much. Helping your student develop the ability to summarize is an important skill that goes well beyond just reorienting our thinking. It also shows that they're understanding what we're doing. So then the last two parts of your review should be vocabulary. Again, this is where if we're going to review past vocabulary, it makes a lot of sense to have had your text marked or your teacher guide marked so that when we're asking them about old vocabulary words, we can ask them about ones that maybe are going to be on the test. I want to avoid the assumption that I'm talking about teaching to the test. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is just being fair, making sure that we are teaching and covering the material with depth that we are going to expect them to know on the test. Okay. Then you can also throw out maybe one or two of the past comprehension questions that we talked about. When you are moving through this material, chapters 1, 2, 3, and so on, if there was a question that they really struggled to formulate, that they really needed your help on, maybe circle that one so that when you get later chapters and you can come back when you're doing the review of the old, you can hit that question again. If they're still struggling with it, that means that you need to spend some time. We really are a mastery-driven program. We don't want to leave any questions in the past that were not mastered. Okay, so that's your review of the old. So now introduce the new. This is what most of us, look at that T that's not crossed. I'm going to use a red one as my little teacher correcting pen, correcting my mistake. So now we're talking about introducing new material. Introducing new material is what most of us think about when we think about teaching a lesson. If we're skipping all of this, we are not being thorough in our teaching of the lesson, though. So all of this matters. But so now we get into the introducing of the new. Introducing the new is generally going to begin with your novel. Typically, we will not have novels and guides open at the same time. It may be necessary at some point, and with older students, it does become necessary because a lot of their work, it becomes independent. They're looking for longer quotations and excerpts, and they're really wrestling with material. At this grade level and below, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, the novel being open during the time where you're working in the guide can really serve as a distraction, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. But you may decide that the first section of your guide, and I suppose we would encourage you to do this, is called reading notes. You may want to hit those first, and you don't necessarily have to have your guide open. What you can do is at the beginning of the chapter, you can write the 2 or 3 or 4 reading note items in your novel, and remember to touch on those. For instance, Turkish delight is in our chapter. Most kids coming into Narnia don't know what Turkish delight is because it's not a dessert that is typically eaten by Americans in the 21st century. So we may want to make a point to say what that is, because if we don't, when we get to Turkish delight in the context of the narrative, it's going to cause a distraction. So that's why those reading notes are there. The reading notes are not meant to be questions you ask the students. They're meant to be information that you give to the students to aid their reading of the text. So you want to start with that, but again, you may not necessarily need to get your guide out to do that. So guides are probably going to be put away and off to the side when you start your lesson, and you're going to begin by reading whatever portion of the narrative that you have decided to read. Again, going back, some of us are going to read all of it, some of us are just going to read excerpts, but all of us are definitely reading something. You want to decide what you're going to read, as we mentioned earlier, based on where you have content that is relevant or is discussed later in the guide. So for instance, I have, for chapter 4, I have it marked here in my text that the first discussion question is answered right in the first paragraph. So you're going to open up your novel, and it's generally a good idea as the teacher to begin the reading. You want to model for your student at this age level, and especially before 3rd, 4th grade, you want to do a lot of the modeling for your student. And so you just want to read. "But what are you?" said the queen again. "Are you a great overgrown dwarf that has cut off its beard?" "No, your majesty," said Edmund. "I never had a beard. I'm a boy." "A boy?" said she. "Do you mean you are a son of Adam?" Edmund stood still, saying nothing. He was too confused by this time to understand what the question meant. By reading aloud, you get to model, and it's okay to go a little over the top, to be a little dramatic, because what you're doing is you are teaching your student how to read. We would say that the reading process has two phases. There's the coding phase, the phonetics, where they're learning what sounds are made by what letters and what happens when you combine certain letters and how those sounds change. But then there's the comprehension portion. And comprehension, it doesn't only have to do with ideas, it has to do with presentation as well. And so the words on the page, they're intended for us to understand based on the words that are chose, the structure that they're put in, the way that some words are used in application of some characters and not in the context of other characters. And so we want to model good reading habits. As often as we want, as important as it is for us to read and model the reading, we also want to hear our students read. So again, at 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, it may take a long time to get through the reading if you have them read everything or a lot. And so you may just want to, if you're going to read 4 or 5 excerpts, you may want to give them 1 or 2, and then you do the rest. But in one way or another, you want to hear them read, and you want them to hear you read as well. So in covering that excerpt, that portion of the text, I know that I have covered what is required by the guide in question 1. So we may have a brief discussion. Again, I'm not going to say, hey, that was one of your comprehension questions. We're not going to say that because that's going to distract from the novel. We do want the student to enjoy the book. We want the student to get lost in the narrative and have fun with the lesson. But I do know that after we've read all of my excerpts, and I can take my novel and I can put it away, I can move on from the novel to the guide portion of the new material. So then we're going to open up our guide together, and we're going to look at the comprehension questions. We're going to look at the vocabulary. So we also made sure in our text that we had the vocabulary underlined or highlighted or annotated in some way. A quick note, if you are sharing a book with your student, it's okay that the text is marked. So when I say we don't want to tell them this is an answer to your comprehension question, I don't mean we want to hide from them the annotating or the marking that you have in your novel. It's a good thing for the student to learn how to mark a book. Now at this age, we do want to introduce them to the idea of marking your book, but we don't want to get too aggressive with that, because if you just hand over a highlighter to your sweet 4th or 5th grade daughter, she is going to make that entire page pink or yellow, or pink and yellow, and she's going to miss the point of why we mark the book. But so it is good for them to see your markings, your asterisks, your underlines, your highlights, and all of that. It is formative for them. But so, okay, we have put this away. We know that we've covered the material. My wife, we have 6 at home, so my wife would be quick here to remind everybody that while it is important to cover, in some sense, all of the comprehension questions, there are a lot of great strategies for how you cover them. If you have marked those that are testable, those that will appear on a test at some point, you can make sure to get those on paper. At this grade level, you can even invite them to write an answer on their own after your discussion, but we do encourage you to then come back around to what they wrote down together with them before moving on, and find out whether or not what they had to say in their own words does align with what the teacher guide expected them to put. I have known some teachers to say that you can even tell them after you've read that the answer to question 2 was on page 36. Again, going back and forth in the novel and then to the guide, I do think that for some students can introduce distraction at younger ages. But if it's working with a student you have, there's no problem in doing it. That is one of the things that's going to prepare them for when they're reading Beowulf, where they will really have to spend time in their text and really look through it and try to analyze and find the answers to the comprehension questions. But again, one of the things that Nikki would really want me to share is that not every answer necessarily needs to have this long, drawn-out sort of formulaic process to finding the answer. She would say, and does say and did say, that some of the comprehension questions for her are simply done orally. If literature is done right before lunch, she may even close up the book and say, all right, let's go get ready for lunch. And while she's making sandwiches or soup, she will read a question out loud to the kids and have them orally give their answer. And this is a way of doing something that kind of allows the student to be in a comfort zone and to be answering very honestly with a genuine thought process behind what they're saying. And it can give you as a teacher a good insight into where their head is with the material you're covering. Okay, so we have worked through our vocab, we've worked through our comprehension questions, and then we have quotations. Quotations are important. They are good to discuss, but there is not any work that's required of your student in their work guide. But the quotation that we reference is usually something that is going to drive at the main idea of that chapter or contribute to the main sort of meta narrative to the book itself. This is another way that we are preparing them to continue moving up that progression, because when they get older, when they get to college, they're going to have to formulate arguments for their ideas about the text that they've read, and they're going to have to cite sources. And so these quotations are one way of getting the student's mind in a place where they begin to understand the importance of drawing your ideas from the text. C.S. Lewis didn't write The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and then just throw it out into the universe and let people think whatever they wanted to think about it. He had something very particular in mind for our understanding of Aslan, for our understanding of the stone table, for our understanding of the Turkish delight. And we want to respect him and the work by doing our best to understand what he wanted us to understand as far as those things are concerned. Discussion questions are the material that are we offer the most wiggle room. They're open-ended. The students are expected to have these done orally. Sometimes there will be an answer in the teacher guide for you. Sometimes there won't. For instance, number 2 in the discussion questions for chapter 4 says, Matthew 26:41 says that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. How does this verse relate to chapter 4? For those of you who have read the book, or even just read what I started to read, we immediately think of Edmund. We think of Edmund, and we think of Edmund as a boy who likely loves his sister, who likely cares for people in general, and yet we see how he behaves when a little bit of hot chocolate and Turkish delight is thrown his way. He falls apart, and he gives in to temptations. And so a discussion question like that, we can ask the question that we asked, how does this verse relate to chapter 4? And then we encourage you to ask a further question about the individual child who's sitting in front of you. Perhaps they've struggled with something lately, and we want to make this verse come alive to them through the use of literature. And then you have the enrichment, and enrichment is something that you do or don't do. This is for you. Again, it's not testable material. This is not really even material that's necessary for understanding, but it can and it does make the story or the narrative or the characters more real in the life of your children. And these are the kind of assignments or the portion of this program that does tend to leave some lasting mark with your students. So for this one in particular, there's a recipe for Turkish delight. A few years ago at our cottage school program here in Louisville, which is a one-day-a-week tutorial for homeschool families, the teacher made Turkish delight, and when they finished reading Narnia, and I made a point to stop by the class and sample the Turkish delight, and I had a student just the other day bring that up when we had some snow here in Louisville, and because the context of the story has to do with snow, it reminded them of the Turkish delight, and they asked me if I remembered eating the Turkish delight, and I didn't really. I do. I had never thought of it again since that time, but it dawned on me that this student probably thinks of it every time it snows. And so that's just a neat way of making the elements of this story permanent in the lives of your students. Okay, so that's your guide, your enrichment. I would say realistically, enrichment is probably being done maybe once or twice per novel for most families. Some of you may want to use it as like an extra credit type of situation. Some of you may want to use it as a way of getting dad involved. It's a really easy way. Sometimes it is as simple as draw a picture of Aslan. Maybe you want to save enrichment for after dinner and have dad jump on that one and say, hey pal, let's do your enrichment. Let's draw a lion together or whatever the guide is asking for you. So those are some thoughts with the enrichment portion. That is our introducing new. You end every lesson with a review of the new material, and I would invite anybody to contribute on this one because I know a lot of you listening have good ideas here. One of the best ways to review the new material and the old material to prep for tests, especially in any class, is to play review games. So some of the review games that we play in our house, I think you told us about, we played Jeopardy, where you just as you play Jeopardy, make a board with columns and rows, and each one has questions, and they fall into a category. And this one's especially fun if you have older students have already read the material, read the novel, and they can play along with you. More participants makes this sort of game better. This is also a good way to infuse community into your homeschooling. You can invite friends to read your novel with you, to do the literature guide with you, and then get together on Fridays or, this is why we homeschool, right? Any day of the week, to do these sort of review games together. Another one is Who Said It? You can show a quote from one of the lessons that you've covered, or from the lesson if it's reviewing the new material. You can read the quote that you looked at in quotations and then ask the student if they remember who said it. Another one could be What Would They Do? Would be a game in which you could present sort of a silly situation to your student, or a situation that is real from your life, from your context, and then ask, what would Edmund do in that situation? What would the White Witch do in that situation? What would Thomas the Fallen do in that situation? What would Lucy do in that situation? And feel free to get silly with it. But even as we get silly, we try to take stock of what their answer is. And does their answer fit with the presentation that Lewis gives of these characters, or does it not? So those are some games. Another thing to do for review is what we sometimes call it rapid fire. Just really quickly go through vocabulary. What was this word? What did that mean? One of the discussion questions. Remember when we talked about the discussion question about the queen? Make something up. Throw a comprehension question back at them. You can tell them, hey, what was that Bible verse that we talked about? And see if they remember. Again, these should be fast. They're not referencing their book or anything like that. And that is you're done. You're done with your lesson. We do encourage, and the lesson plans will show you, rereading is healthy. It's good. Looking back over a chapter that you've already studied and rereading, whether it's independent or as a read aloud. I don't know that I, as an individual, recommend doing that with every chapter for every book. I think that is one of the areas where if you need to sacrifice, you can sacrifice there. But it is healthy, it is helpful to reread material, and the lesson plans will typically introduce that component at the end of the week. Or so if the week has 2 chapters, it'll say on a Friday, reread chapters 3 and 4. C.S. Lewis said that a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is not a good children's story at all. So to bring us full circle back to what my wife had shared with me, it's very true. This subject in particular really should be a subject that you enjoy with your students. If there are hurdles and stressors that are getting involved that are causing you to not enjoy it, causing your student to not enjoy it, we would say slow down. We are all about digging really deep and mastering and fully understanding whatever it is that we're pursuing. We're not about creating a wide, inch-deep environment for your students. We want them to know what they're doing. So if there are struggles there, push the last novel out and drag Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe out. Slow it down, do whatever you need to do to make it enjoyable and enjoy that time with your students. That's all we have for today. If there are questions, throw them in the comments, share them. If you have answers to questions people are asking, jump on and share them as well. And we appreciate you guys being here. Have a great rest of the day.